Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Biz. I really am here today with Tim White. We really are doing this today and not yesterday. That's apparently I don't know my days of the week yet, which is a bit of a worry. Anyway, welcome everybody. There's so much to talk about today because so much is happening in Ukraine. Both in terms of the military, also obviously politically, environmentally, even the dam and whatnot. It's just so much going on, and I'm really happy to be able to delve into some of these topics with Tim White for the fourth time. So go and check out previous live chats we've had in the past. Just check on the live feed to my my other channel, my A Tippling Philosopher channel, and you can check out those interviews. Tim, thanks, welcome. Do you want to give a quick introduction to those people who don't know you and your connections to Ukraine?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jonathan. And I think we should stop arranging these things after midnight when we're trying to decipher which day is which. But words like tomorrow don't go down very well at like 15 minutes past midnight. But so apologies for anyone who was inconvenienced by a no-show yesterday, although it wasn't really, was it? You gave everyone enough time. And we are here. And gosh, is it the fourth time already? But there again, is it nearly 16 months already? How time has flown by, and quite disastrously so, since that week in February of 2022. And just a few days before that, I was in Kiev working, as I have often done, an association with Ukraine. And most of my work is in Kiev for more than 2 decades now. I've worked for the #1 university in Ukraine, the Mahila Academy, which the Kiev Business School is part of that establishment as well, very world renowned. And that was the university that first saw real independence and saw the growing problems with Russian imperialistic rule on Ukraine, and helped very largely in the first Maidan, when Russia tried to steal that election. And that was when I first became really interested. I'd already started working in Ukraine at that time, so that was over 2 decades ago. And I've learned such a lot and made so many friends there. And I've been doing various things, including documentaries. If you Google Tim White Ukraine, you'll find an awful lot on my Twitter feed, and my documentary is hidden in there somewhere as well. And Twitter every single day since the start of the war, and indeed before that, I've been tweeting the news about Ukraine, but particularly with regard to the full invasion, which is now 471 days ago. I think we're on day 471 today, but sometimes I do lose count. And it takes up an awful lot of time to do that.
Yeah, I have to say, like I as you know, my channel audience knows I use your stream quite a lot. Your Twitter handle gets a lot of plugging from myself. I think everyone should follow Tim on Twitter. Tim, I don't know if he ever gets sleep, because he's posting stuff at like insane times of the night, morning. I'm like, is he in this country? He can't be posting at that time, but he is. So he's indefatigable. Please support him on Twitter by following him. Go to buy me a coffee. On Ko-fi. Yeah, that's really, really important to support. Otherwise, Tim will not continue doing all the wonderful things he does. So if you can find a time to do that, that'd be really, really appreciated. Okay, so I guess where do we start? Right, we've got a growing counteroffensive that's taking place, particularly around the Zaporizhia area. We've got the counter attacks taking place in Bakhmut. There's been a swing in initiative, a momentum towards Ukraine. However, they are going to find it difficult. They will have their losses, but at the same time, we've got the dam exploding, and we'll talk about that, I guess, first. But before we talk about that, you've got connections in Ukraine that I presume you talk to. What do they feel about the counteroffensive going forward? What do they feel about the situation Ukraine are in right now? What's your sense?
Quite positive, actually, Jonathan, I have to say. I thought they might be a little bit nervous, but there isn't really any nerves that I've seen. They're all fairly expectant. And I think that's one thing that we've been wondering, why, sitting in a third country, why the Ukrainian government has seemed to be playing it down at every single turn, every interview. Don't expect too much, playing down those expectations, because the expectations And the confidence in the ZSU, the Ukrainian army, is absolutely sky high in Ukraine. They're absolutely convinced they'll win. It's just a matter of when, and most of them think it'll be fairly early. And they're very confident in even getting the whole of Crimea back before the end of this year. And I think one of the intelligence officers has actually said it'll be before winter. So I think that's possibly a little optimistic, but optimism sometimes is not a bad thing. And yeah, generally people that I've spoken to, every single one knows without any shadow of a doubt that the Kakhovka Dam was destroyed by Russia. There's pretty much ample evidence on that would probably even withstand a criminal prosecution in a court of law, let alone the balance of probability. And it's very difficult to give the exact situation, as I've said this morning. I know you've been saying, because we're relying on second or third hand reports, and some of those may be just completely made up and maybe pure propaganda. Others may only be telling partial truths around what's happening, particularly in Zaporizhia at the moment. But I think it's looking promising for Ukraine. We haven't seen the full counteroffensive yet, for sure. It's as I would describe it, stage 2, and my friends and colleagues in Ukraine agree at the moment as well. The first was to try and destroy a lot of the infrastructure behind the enemy lines, a lot of the artillery systems. The daily numbers that are published by Ukraine shows how high those have been for about 2 months now. Consistently, massive amounts of artillery has been destroyed belonging to the Russians in the occupied territories. And now stage 2 is the probing, the pushing, the trying to pull Russian forces around, seeing how strong their defenses are in numerical terms as well as equipment, looking for weak spots. And obviously there'll be a few dummy runs or feints in there as well, trying to move a lot of personnel from one place to another, and then striking in 2 or 3 separate places. That's how I imagine it will play out over the next couple of weeks or so.
Yeah, so they're often, deception is such a huge part of warfare. It's you are going to expect there to be attacks in certain places that won't be their primary objective, but it'll be to throw them off the scent. But then you get the idea that if they succeed in that decoy, in that feint, then actually that produces a weakness, then they can adapt and actually make that a major attack. I've seen it quite quiet up on the Luhansk front, so going up from Kupiansk, or going down from Kupiansk to Svatova to Kreminna, and I was expecting during the counterattack in Kharkiv for that area to be, I was hoping they could advance as far as Starobilsk, because that's quite a big logistical hub. But they seem to be really quiet. They seem to have forgotten, and I don't know whether that means you could see a sudden surprise attack there or not. But I don't know. It seems quiet up there.
Well, it is compared to the news that we're getting from other areas of the front, particularly the Zaporizhia to Donetsk line that's almost straight, really, at that part of the front line. But there have been major hits on personnel and equipment in Luhansk, in the city yesterday, in Kreminna also within the last week. And there have been other smaller hits around there as well. Probably the area where Russia has had most success in the last few weeks has been around Kupiansk. There are credible reports that they might have even crossed the river at one point. Whether they've been pushed back or whether they've got a stronghold there remains to be seen. They could get into Kupiansk even. But I think the main objective, if you say there's got to be one objective right now, to keep Western allies happy and confident that this is a war worth backing continuously for as long as it takes, is to breach the Russian defenses and get to the south coast. So while it would be desirable to push back in the north and further protect Crimea and move it completely out of artillery range if possible, because of its proximity to the border with Belgorod, that's not really going to happen. And therefore, you have to say, or I would say, that somewhere along that Zaporizhia front, and the Russians are aware of that, if Ukraine can get down to the south coast to somewhere near Berdyansk, Mariupol, somewhere around there, it cuts off the land border to Crimea, and that presents huge amounts of problems for the Russians. And it's possible then we may even see a few attacks on the Kerch bridge, because if Russia thinks that they could be trapped in there, then without supplies being able to get through, then that could be the end of a large part of this war, and probably the very start of the very end of the war.
There's an interesting idea in that, though, because I've seen some analysis saying that the Ukrainians won't hit the Kerch Bridge. I think it comes from Sun Tzu. If your enemy's trying to retreat, you should build them a golden bridge type thing. And the idea is that if they absolutely hammer Crimea to make it untenable for the Russians to remain there, then actually the Kerch Bridge serves as a really useful off ramp for them. And so there's something, because originally I was thinking, of course they're going to blow up the Kerch Bridge, and now I'm thinking, actually, I'm not so sure they'll blow it up.
Well, there is that. I don't think it'll happen simultaneously. I think there will be this 2-3 week period to see. But if there's absolutely no action and weapons are flooding in, then it becomes, I mean, you've got to make quite a quick decision. But yeah, I agree. There'll be a lot of people who will be scared. There'll be a lot of troops. There may be a rebellion, and you need to allow them that escape route. If commanders are joining them in rebellion and saying this isn't a fight worth fighting, and Prigozhin's stoking it up and still around to criticize the Russian army, then sure. But if they are just bringing in humongous amounts of weapons and more personnel, more conscripts, potentially general full mobilization, then I think you have to cut off that artery and strengthen your own position, because it's very easy for us to talk about and imagine on a map, oh yeah, if you just draw that line down and you split the two parts of the Russian army, then that'll be easy. But maintaining that when you've got battalions on both sides and artillery on both sides firing at you on however big a strip of land you get will be equally as difficult as taking it. And that's why you have to cut the supply lines from both sides. And it's going to be far easier to isolate Crimea in that position, I would imagine.
Yeah, as John Jones says here, said, yeah, leave the road bridge, but take out the rail bridge. And then, and I think that's probably a good compromise between the two. So going, I'm sure we'll return to the front line. I mean, there's a lot to talk about there, but just I want to talk about the dam for a second, because I said yesterday, I think that the dam was a greater issue, like escalation, than a tactical nuke. So a tactical nuke, it depends how big a tactical nuke you're talking about. But if you're talking about like a 1 kiloton, smallest tactical nuke, it's going to take out maybe a kilometer, right? And then you get radiation there and stuff. Now, if Russia had done that, then the whole world would have gone nuts. NATO would have got involved and blah, blah, blah. But I think that the lasting effects of the dam being destroyed is greater than the use of a tactical nuke. And yet everyone else has said, oh, that's terrible, but it's not been escalatory to the way that we responded. Well, what are your thoughts about that? The way that the allies have responded?
Jonathan, I'm so disappointed at the response generally from almost everyone, from the US and the UK not releasing intelligence or seeming to ignore the intelligence that was out there from when the original Kherson retreat happened, when we know they mined the bridge, when they were admitting it. The fact that Russia's first defense, if you like, of saying it wasn't us was to say it was shelling, which is just impossible. Not even HIMARS will get through that. And if you're wondering how that's possible, just imagine the pressure, the weight of all that water on one wall. It won't just give in to a bit of shelling. It can withstand earthquakes. It has to stop the sort of catastrophe, thousands of lives in danger, as we've seen. And as you said, the long-term effects are absolutely catastrophic. And it's another example that many people will be citing of the attempted genocide of Ukraine, because this will cut off an awful lot of their capacity to grow food, to be self-sufficient, as well as the destruction of the houses. The land, some of the most fertile, will not be able to be restored for generations. I think it's fair to say. I mean, to reconstruct another dam would take an awful long time, even after hostilities have finished. And who's going to pay for the dam? It's to the extent now where reparations from Russia are not likely to be able to do good all the damage that's been caused, even if they lose the war, when remembering what happened in the interwar periods between the First and Second World War, and the problems that Germany had, and the nationalism that grew off the back of extra punitive damages. So it's a very tricky situation. But yeah, in general, even the aid agencies, I mean, not basically forcing themselves into Russian territory to rescue those poor people who are still stuck on roofs with their ground floors completely full of water. Even though it started to recede in some of the areas nearest the dam, it is still rising in some of the further outlying areas, and some of the islands still in the river itself. I think it's just an absolute disgrace, an international disgrace, that this has been allowed to happen, and that the condemnation hasn't been absolutely unequivocal, that the intelligence hasn't been published, and that the aid agencies have not helped anywhere near enough.
Yeah, I fully agree with everything you said there. And, it's made even worse that the Russians are shelling evacuation attempts in the area. It's just as if, yeah. But I was wondering whether because my working theory is that the Russians planned this, and we've got video evidence of them admitting to mining it back from December. We've got Telegram and social media evidence that they'd mined it back in October. Then the explosions took place on the Russian part of the dam that they control, and it has to be internal explosions to have done that kind of damage. But my theory is that they were trying to blow the dam and cause some flooding to stop the counter-offensive being able to get across the Dnipro, just stop the Ukrainians from being able to do that, which, you can see tactical sense in that. But it just was way worse than they'd expected, and the dam blew out even more, and it was therefore the whole flooding was just catastrophic. And we kind of get the idea because the Russians themselves didn't get their troops out of the way enough. And so I don't know. That's my working theory. I don't know if you have anything to say to that.
Yeah, and that's corroborated by the audio recording, supposedly, of a tapped phone call that Ukrainian intelligence released this morning. I don't know if you've seen. No,
I've not seen this.
So that's in my feed this morning. I've done a very brief translation. I don't know whether someone's managed to put subtitles up yet, but yeah, it's there, posted probably only a couple of hours or so ago, I would think. And although it's all in Russian, the translation basically is someone saying, "Oh, they've blown the dam. It was our sabotage guys." And listening to it and the way that it's spoken, particularly the words "a little bit more than we intended," does back up your theory that it was supposedly going to be just something to scare the Ukrainians, to cause them a bit of damage, but it got out of hand, and they clearly don't have very many intelligent people or very many physicists to be able to tell you, and engineers, that it's very difficult to plug. You can't put your finger in a little hole in the dam and stop it when you want. With that amount of water, that pressure, that volume, it just collapses. And if you make an explosion big enough to be able to cut a hole in a dam, that's the end of the dam.
Yeah, that interesting, and I'm glad that there's at least some corroboration of that, because sometimes I get the imposter syndrome and I think I don't know what I'm talking about. So that's great. Well, look, before we continue on that, I just want to. There's a super chat here. Thank you so much, Carlos Durand. Really, really generous. Super chat here saying, "Are Western governments fearful of a Ukrainian victory?" Be interesting how you interpret that, and what does a Ukrainian victory look like now? So I guess this is going back to the counteroffensive and about expectations. Do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, okay. I don't think Western governments are fearful of Ukrainian victory. I think there's a legitimate fear from some of the, shall we say, more of dove-like nations, those who've countenanced Russian breaking of promises before a little bit more, and a bit too much naivety. And we're speaking specifically about France and Germany in a past life, and whether that still continues. There are still doubts about both Macron and Schulz, but Schulz has been much better of late in terms of rallying the allies together. And I think the fear that some of those people have, and I think it is a legitimate fear, is that if Ukraine is admitted into NATO, there's still a lot of pro-Russian people suspected to be inside Ukraine. There are still a lot of Russian speakers. We've seen before democracy, and then suddenly Yanukovych was elected by a nation that was turning to the left, and in a fair and open democracy and democratic vote, they then suddenly lurch back to the guy who'd illegally stolen the previous election, who was a convicted thief, a very much pro-Russian. And so do you admit a nation like that into NATO and offer to protect them when you are fearful of what's happened in the recent past? And, well, who's to say that there won't be more Russian infiltration and propaganda? And then suddenly one of our own members of NATO is beholden to Russia. What happens then? And there are the other fears about a nation that's already at war, and should we bend the rules to allow them to join right now, or can we protect them any further, as in a full NATO member without actually the paperwork being signed? But going back to the specifics of Carlos's question, thanks for the donation, Carlos. What does Ukrainian victory look like now? Although no one will admit it, I think the last time I was here with Jonathan, I said the same, that if Ukraine manages to recover all its mainland territory and is forced to accept that Crimea is potentially a completely independent nation, then maybe returning to the state it was before as autonomous under Ukrainian boundaries, then that might have to be accepted. Zelensky has said that no way, we want all of Crimea back and there won't be any autonomy. It will be back as part of Ukraine proper. I think a lot of people in the West see that that's something that is open to discussion and could be an olive branch to let Putin or his successor feel or to sell to the public like, well, at least we saved Crimea. You know, all the damage that Putin did, if it's Prigozhin or Patrushev or whoever comes in after, can say, I saved Crimea, we would have lost it. And it was only through our negotiations and what we had to give up that we've saved Crimea. The problem is that there are numerous calls from all these hotheads and probably under the pay of some influence from Russia in Africa that are coming over and demanding that Ukraine and Russia have independent elections and plebiscites in these occupied territories, which is just a non-starter because they're almost completely devoid now of people who will openly support Ukraine. Even if they do, as we've seen in Mariupol, some people still bravely waving a flag. They're in court, they're beaten, they lose any help, any benefits. They are, if they're not killed, that is, mysteriously disappearing. We saw it in Crimea immediately before and after the invasion in 2014. So for me, the entire Ukraine territory on the mainland, if you like, has to be returned unequivocally to complete Ukrainian control and democracy and law. Crimea, I suspect, may still be a bargaining chip, and unpalatable as that is, it may be something that Ukraine has to face in future. But if the Russian army capitulates under this forthcoming pressure very quickly, then Ukraine may be able to get the job done, as it were, without any negotiation about Crimea. But I think it's probably more likely that Crimea will be a discussion for the future.
Yeah, because I think, you know, for as far as Russia are concerned, now at this point in the war that was accidental for them. So they planned, I keep saying this, but they initially planned a special military operation. I mean, that was we joke about this, but they literally planned a special military operation that you know, was to get rid of the Kyiv government, replace it with their own in a 3-day period, then clear up everything over 2 to 3 weeks. Job done. Thank you very much. Now we've got a puppet government. And then that didn't happen. That couldn't happen because the Russians were met with so much resistance. And then they're like, oh, bugger, we're in Ukraine. What do we do now? We're now at war for something we hadn't planned for. And they had their army there. And so then it's like, okay, well, what does victory look like for Russia? And then it kept going back and back and back. Then they were going to take Kyiv. No, they couldn't do that. Then they were going to take the entire of this region. Well, they couldn't. They had to retreat from Kharkiv. Then it's the Donbass. Then it's just Bakhmut. And then, you know, it gets smaller and smaller. So you're thinking, well, Putin would want to extricate himself from this war with Crimea. They're like the minimum. I think all they want, I'd say they'd happily lose Donbass. They just, for the reason of Sevastopol as a port, they'd want Crimea. But then the flip side to that is that even if you gave them Crimea, the Ukrainians could still make hell for the Russians, but having Sevastopol with naval drones and all sorts, I don't know, it's all just a bit of a nightmare.
Yeah, it is. But I think one important factor to consider here is the Russian general public, if we can generalize, is seen as supporting the war. I think a lot do just patriotically, nationally support their army without actually thinking too deep into what is actually happening, because it isn't touching their lives. It's just starting to now in Belgorod and a couple of other areas, and with mobilization happening, SMS messages have been sent out in the last few days to people in St. Petersburg urging them to register at a military office, whereupon I understand that they're being pressured a little bit, advised that they should sign up to the army, but it's not actually happening full scale yet. They're not being forced and led in handcuffs when they answer at the registration office. At least we're not getting that report yet. So I think it comes back to, if you asked the average, if there is such a thing, man and woman in St. Petersburg, in Kazan, in Yekaterinburg, is Donbass, is the city of Donetsk Russian? I think most people would say no. If you said, is Sevastopol Russian, Simferopol, people would say, yes, it's Russian. And I think that is the big factor. Is Zaporizhia Russian? No, absolutely not. Is Tokmak? I don't even know. Where are these places? They'd be saying. So I think the Russian psyche is, and has been, even whilst it was under Ukrainian control, because it didn't really register, was that Crimea was Russian. And with the massive naval parades and military celebrations constantly there as well, featured on Russian TV, that dripped into the psyche. There was never any of that, never any talk of Donetsk being Russian. It was the city that actually, the protests of the miners there sparked the call for independence for Ukraine way back at the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So I think the ordinary public in Russia would certainly accept the withdrawal of all Russian forces from mainland Ukraine, but less so from Crimea. And as you said, for any new president or the existing one, whom I still don't think will survive this, it would be completely unpalatable to lose Crimea. And if Crimea is lost, then all the blame would be heaped on Putin, and a new leader wouldn't emerge until he'd made absolutely sure that Putin was to blame for everything, along with Shoigu or whoever else they want to get rid of conveniently at that time.
To answer the question, what do I think Ukrainian victory looks like? If you're talking about the immediate counter-offensive, like what would they definitely need to achieve by this counter-offensive? I think they need to be in a position, and I don't think they need to necessarily be at the gates of Crimea. They don't need to be at the Perekop Isthmus or anywhere like that. But although that would help, but I think that they could get close enough. As Zelensky talked about getting 84 kilometers away by being at Melitopol, but you need to get close enough to Crimea to hammer it with every single bit of aerial munition you can. Drones, Storm Shadow, HIMARS, and ATACMS if you can get hold of them. And so that the Russians, it's untenable for them to have this. Like, yeah, you can have Crimea, but it's going to be useless because you can't use Sevastopol. They're already moving their ships over to another port in the Black Sea. So it's already fairly untenable and not the useful thing it should be. And I think that victory for me in the immediate sense would be making Crimea untenable, and then you force Russia to the negotiation table, perhaps. I don't know, but I mean, do you think so? Talking about you mentioned about Putin won't be long for this world or long for ruling. What do you mean by that? Because one of the questions here is which threshold would have to be crossed for the dissolution of the Russian Federation to be a real possibility, and is a coup or an insurrection more likely?
Wow, what a difficult question. I mean, simplistically, I don't think Putin can survive this. Now, whether we see a Russian Federation continue in its present form, almost exactly the same, just without Ukraine and or without Crimea, but with a new leader, that is probably the most likely scenario. Whether then, and I don't, the elections are a year away in Georgia, we could see Georgia with a new government trying to recapture the two territories that were stolen and occupied by Russia from the Georgian war. We could also see an uprising, potentially, even Kadyrov. I mean, his family has switched sides once from fighting for independence and then against Russia and against Putin to then suddenly being pro-Putin with a lot of promises of a lot of money and their own fiefdom, allowed to govern pretty much how they want with their own army. Who's to say that he won't move back again if he sees that someone else is coming in who's not going to back him and is actually going to ostracize him? If there's more power for Prigozhin, it could, you can see how Dagestan and Chechnya in the south could fight again for independence. So certain problems may arise internally for Russia. I think it's unrealistic to think, I think it's wishful thinking that places like Belgorod would suddenly decide that they're not Russian. I mean, historically, you can make a case for Krasnodar as well in the south as having been attached to old Ukraine under Kiev Rus a long, long time ago. But I don't think there's any appetite for independence among many of the federations. But it can be a domino effect if one or two start falling and there's huge sanctions on Russia and huge reparations and the standard of living continues to fall. We've seen the ruble continue to fall this morning, something else I highlighted today, the lowest 14 months, and that's even after the OPEC meeting restricting oil output. Shows what a dire position Russia is in financially, even now. Imagine what it will be like if they've lost the war and they have to settle and start paying reparations. So
yeah, it's been really difficult to try and work out where Russia is economically speaking, because they're you can't trust their figures. So they're saying we've got a growth prediction, we've got this is happening, and of course their figures are just potentially pie in the sky, made up, pulled out
I've
their
seen
posteriors.
two reports, though, Jonathan, one of which I did highlight. Now, whether the second came off that from a business organization in Russia that has never posted anything anti-Russian, anti-Putin, saying that the reserves had fallen by 80%. I mean, that's catastrophic for any nation. I mean, once you get down to the last 20%, you are almost scraping the barrel. And how they're going to use that 20% and how much they're actually going to have to save, and whether they just go completely bankrupt. Now that causes immense problems, because they are still paying for the likes of drones from Iran. I would imagine they're probably paying North Korea for any assistance, South Africa if they are getting weapons from there, as has been alleged. China, there's probably some there isn't always a quid pro quo unless they're going to start giving off parts of Vladivostok and the Far East to China. So huge problems down the line, but it's not that far down the line now for Russia financially. They cannot, under these sanctions and without a huge boom in the oil price, they cannot continue this war for too much longer in its present state.
Yeah, and it's interesting because as well, the more they're spending on the war, the less they're spending on welfare and running the country. So the people within Russia then start getting grumbling because actually things are falling apart, or they're not getting. I mean, we already know that they're not able to pay. So in the sort of DNR and LNR, so Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, they're not able to pay compensation to people who have been killed or injured, and they've said we've got no money. Well, that's part of Russia, right? So that's Russia admitting, hey, we ain't got money to pay compensation for the troops that are lost. So it's like there's going to be people grumbling, right?
You'd imagine so, and we've seen, haven't we, a few times, different units in the Luhansk army or Donetsk army having little protests, and we wonder how many of those are video but never come to light, or how many of those are internal and then people are jailed or threatened or beaten. There's a lot that will go on behind the scenes that we don't know about, but yeah, there is a certain amount of discontent. And bear in mind, something we've said, both of us, right from day one: one side is fighting for its very existence, for their very lives, for their very houses, their very territory. The other side doesn't really know. The general troops, they don't really know what they're fighting for. They think they might be fighting like their grandfathers did against Nazism, but it soon dawns on them that these guys are not welcoming them with open arms, that almost every person in Ukraine hates them with a passion and wants them to die a very evil and slow death. And that must come as quite a jolt to these guys who, okay, we're going to a war, but it's a war we believe in. And then suddenly thinking, actually, should I be questioning, and am I actually really happy here? And I think we're getting an increase in admission of the number of deserters that are happening. And slow trickle can very quickly become a deluge. And there's just so many problems right now for Russia. Ukraine is losing a lot of people and a lot of equipment in this counteroffensive that is just getting underway. But there are far more fundamental problems for Russia.
Yeah, so a pro-Russian in my thread has said, yeah, but Russia's part of BRICS. It's a new trade bloc that rivals the West because it has China and India. So BRICS, for those that don't know, is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and two of the world's biggest developing markets. Yeah, but my comeback to that would be, yeah, well, Brazil's tried to do an international trade currency with Argentina and not with BRICS. And actually, Lula is positioning himself slightly distantly from Russia. He's like treading a fine line. You've got China that are actually sitting off, not really overly supportive of Russia, because my personal opinion is that China would actually benefit more if Russia lost, because they'd help themselves to the hydrocarbons, they'd help themselves to the east, they'd help themselves to all sorts. And I don't think South Africa are particularly bothered either way, and India are not particularly friendly with China. So I don't know that BRICS can be relied on to support Russia.
No, absolutely not. I mean, the BRICS is fantastic for China, for India in particular, in that they are getting huge riches out of this war because they're buying oil at ridiculously cheap prices, and Russia has no other markets. So both India and China have been pretty canny. but pretty mercenary in saying, well, this is the limit you're going to get from anyone else. So we're going to give you just about that, slightly more. And then we're going to sell it back to the people who are going to buy it at $20 a barrel higher. So they are, taking cash out of the pockets of the Russian people, out of the Kremlin and out of the Russian war machine. Because if Russia was getting full price for its oil, it wouldn't be in the predicament it's in. But they can't afford to lose these allies, because where else would they sell? It's like having stolen goods in a pub. You can't get full price for them, but you've got to get rid of them. Otherwise, you can't survive. So that's the dilemma they're faced with. And none of their so-called rivals seems to be treating them as an equal, with perhaps the exception of Iran. And so one wonders there if they're getting some nuclear technology, some help with enriching uranium between the two, because I wonder what Russia is giving Iran, because it can't purely be cash, the amount of weapons they've got.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. China, when Xi Jinping visited Moscow fairly recently, there was a lot of talk about, oh, this is you're going to be really good for Russia and they're going to get closer. But actually, when you look at what was said, Xi Jinping said very little and gave nothing, and Russia gave China loads of stuff. It was really asymmetrical. And then a few weeks later, suddenly China have access to Vladivostok, the port on the eastern border, on the eastern coast of Russia. And so China, it's any kind of negotiations, right? China are in the power position. They can basically dictate anything to Russia. Russia are screwed and they need as much help as they can get. So if China say, yeah, we'll help you in this very tiny way, but you've got to give us this, Russia are going to do that.
Yeah, it's almost propaganda from China that Russia is getting, and very little else, as you say. And China knew right from the start that this war was going to be good for them. They're potentially two biggest rivals, one territorially, geographically, where they still have claims on some of the territory in the Far East, and one in the global market, and to shake up the global power balance, perhaps the USA, of course. And so the longer this war goes on, and the more these two countries exhaust their weapons supply as well as their bank balances, then the stronger China emerges every single day. So they're just playing a little balancing game, getting what they can financially out of Russia, but at the same time, not losing any of their markets. And as you said, saying nothing, just turning up, smiling, sending dignitaries, putting up a peace plan that they absolutely know won't be followed by anyone. So the war continues, and China just sits there and rubs its hands and waits for the day they get their next cheap goods, or the next access to Russian markets or Russian ports, or down the line some Russian land as well.
Because China are also in a position where this has been argued for several years now, but they're on the precipice of a recession, so supposedly. But also they've got issues with their population demographics and the growing older generations there. So, and not enough younger people, and that the issues with that actually the whole of the world will be facing pretty soon. And that means that they're very unlikely to follow ideology as opposed to economy and utilitarian decisions. So they're going to be looking at this saying, right, if we support Russia from an ideological position, we'll be screwed over by sanctions and that. And it's just, we will then have a huge recession. Is not in their best interest. So yeah, I agree. They're just sitting off, waiting and not getting involved. Thank you so much to Jojo, who has given a super sticker, really generous super sticker. Thank you so much, Jojo. Super kind of you. Thank you. So having a look at say some internal politics in Ukraine. You speak to Ukrainians more often than I do. What's your sense of the popularity of Zelensky? Is he still got the country with him? He's had to make occasionally a couple of legal decisions in terms of this is wartime, and people need to understand that actually in wartime you do come down hard on X and Y. You've got to keep a tight ship. Do you think he's still very popular?
Hugely so, absolutely. There's nothing like a war, is there, to engender nationalism and get a government re-elected, as one could argue even Maggie Thatcher found that, for those who know their British and Argentinian history. But it's been tried again and again by nations, and you could argue that Putin needed a little injection of nationalism because his popularity was okay, but showing signs again of perhaps just starting to wane. So he annexed Crimea and got a huge boost, and then try to annex parts of Ukraine and take over the entirety of Ukraine. So anything that Zelensky does at the moment, he cannot really do anything wrong with the majority of the population. There are certain grumblings, but they kind of just accept it. And there is this very united front in favor of defending territory, in favor of Ukraine's existence. And of course, Zelensky is the head of that. So there are murmurings and grumblings, and those, should we say, the cognoscenti and some academics are particularly worried. And I don't class myself as either of those, but I'm particularly worried about democracy in future. There's already been an attempt to marginalize Klitschko in particular, and that we've seen has risen its head again. There are some representatives in Zelensky's office who arguably should not be there, lustration laws, connections with Russia that have gone back, that have been denied. Yermak in particular, there's a lot of disgruntlement with, but in general, it's just all about Zelensky and Zelensky in particular, who's an absolute hero. There are some problems, some discontent with the Ministry of Defense, the procurement scandal when there was a lot of corruption, and the process of buying food at exorbitant prices where you could get cheaper if you just went into a local supermarket for the troops was a huge scandal. And I'm surprised that Reznikov managed to survive that, but he has done and continues.
I wonder if that's because he was so, like, he has done a good job in his role as defense minister around the world, whipping up, donations and support from allies. And I wonder whether you kind of, what's the saying? You don't get off your horse halfway through crossing the river or something like that, which is to say that, if you're in the middle of situations like this, in peacetime, you would sack him and, because of overseeing that incorrectly, but actually right now is the wrong time to sack him, and actually we need him, and he's made these contacts around the world and he has these relationships. That's how I would read that.
Yeah, that's a fair comment, and he has been in an ambassadorial role very good. And one does wonder, when heads of department in the UK or US or in Ukraine lose their jobs over something like that, I do often wonder, they're the fall guy. Did they actually know what was going on? I mean, is it Reznikov's job to negotiate contracts between a third party and getting food to the troops and supplies to the troops? I'm not sure, but there is still a little bit of resentment, and there's been another minor flare up on that issue recently as well. From the people who I know who are in the army, probably not quite as enamored with Zelensky for a number of reasons. There was quite a lot of support among the original serving members of the army for Poroshenko, who'd entirely just completely from nothing almost. I mean, Ukraine almost didn't have an army. It had ill-disciplined members of what was called an army, and Poroshenko sorted them out and got them to a position where they managed to defend the line, and were on the verge of winning the war back in 2014 when they regained Slavyansk, among other places, until Russia suddenly poured in huge amounts of their own troops and their own weaponry. But so there's still a lot of sympathy within the armed forces for Poroshenko. The media is working against the former president for sure, absolutely. So it's still a very difficult question about how much undying support there is for Zelensky, but he's clearly done a wonderful job on so many fronts, and deserves the chance to take Ukraine into the next stage of its existence when it has won the war. And hopefully then we'll see real and fair reform, so we won't see any more consolidation of powers, which is not what Ukraine needs. It needs a liberal democracy. It doesn't need more powers for the president. But
it's interesting. I'm reading a book by a Ukrainian historian. I read his previous book called The Gates of Europe, Ukraine, the Gates of Europe. I'm now reading the Russia-Ukrainian War. He's just brought out a book that includes the beginning of the war. And it's interesting seeing how Russia did their experiment with democracy, and it kind of failed, but Ukraine as a parallel didn't experiment but persevered, and it succeeded, and they made all these, seeing the decisions they made that actually all about power, democratic sort of
well so did Georgia, but look what's happened there. The Georgian dream has turned into a nightmare. You have a de facto Russian puppet basically
Yeah.
in there. And to the astonishment of the president, who is a token figurehead, much like in the UK, the head of state, and has no power. Excuse me. And that's why I mentioned earlier about the possible change in government. I would imagine from all the opinion polls and people I'm speaking to would happen next year in the 2024 elections. So there is still that fear. James, at this point, is on the screen, as people can see, and it's a fair point. I think I did say that Zelensky was not as popular within the armed forces, which I've reiterated now. Going further east, there is still a very small section of society that is still pro-Russian and is still watching Russian media and is still believing the propaganda, still fearful that they won't be able to speak Russian and things like that. So there are still certain sympathies with Russia or with a Ukrainian party that no longer exists, but for instance, the Party of Regions that would be Ukrainian, but would be able to do deals and have good negotiations and good relationships with Russia. So they would be ostensibly anti-Zelensky and would back another candidate in an election. That wouldn't change. But I think we found that so many people, and particularly a generational thing now, I don't know anyone under the age of 40 genuinely who speaks Russian as a first language now. The only time they speak Russian is when they have to with their elderly parents or aunts or uncles who don't know Ukrainian so well. But every single person now that I know, just a personal little insight, speaks Ukrainian first and admonishes me because I don't know Ukrainian, but I know Russian reasonably. So, maybe things are changing in reply to James's point. But yeah, there will still be some anti-Zelensky, anti-Ukraine nationalist with a small n, not the Nazi, but the sentiment that's pervading at the moment in trying to protect their country as you do go further east and south for that matter. Still a lot of people speaking Russian in Odessa on the south coast, for instance, in Kherson. But generally, you can almost do anything in a war, can't you? There was some grumblings over the payments as well being made to the personnel serving in the army. So there are ongoing issues, but everyone realizes at the moment they're trying to pull in one direction. They'll save the arguments for after the war.
Yeah, and just to talk to what you were mentioning there, it's called the rally round the flag effect. So this happened in 1982. So Margaret Thatcher came into the UK in 1979. She wasn't very popular and then went to war in the Falklands and became very popular. Everyone unites, rallies around the flag. It happened with Bush in 9/11. It became super popular after that. And indeed, what's his face? The old mayor of New York as well, who is now...
Giuliani.
Yeah, Rudy Giuliani was popular after 9/11 with, you rally round the flag when you're feeling like you're threatened and attacked. So that's been a very real thing, I imagine, for Zelensky. Thank you so much to Eaten by Ghouls. So really kind of you. If the counteroffensive fails, do you think it'll have an effect on the West's support for Ukraine negatively or positively? Will we get burnout?
It's a real fear. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what the UK fears most as one of the leaders, not just because we're British and UK centric, but remember that Boris Johnson was probably the first to really support Ukraine, along with the Baltic states, but to show that intent and to almost shame the EU. Now, the UK will carry on, but it can't do it alone. And the US, although there's a lot of lend-lease, is still giving an awful lot of money and weapons and assistance to Ukraine. And whether if a GOP Republican candidate was to win the presidency, that would continue at the same rate is very open debate and probably wouldn't. And that's the one thing that Putin is holding out for. If the counteroffensive was to fail, then I'm sure there'd be growing calls among the likes that I mentioned earlier of Macron and Scholz, France and Germany to try to settle around a negotiating table, which is anathema to Zelensky and to virtually all Ukrainians. They were sold out by Germany and France over the Minsk negotiations, which were shambles. Russia keeps saying that Ukraine broke them. Russia didn't obey a single agreement there either. They were supposed to hand over total control of the borders. They didn't do so. So you'll see lots of idiots, Russian trolls, if you're in favor of Ukraine, writing about the Minsk agreements to you. They were appalling. And there was a reason why Russia objected and didn't allow the two guarantor powers for Ukraine originally in the Budapest memorandum, the UK and the US, at the negotiating table. They knew that France and Germany could be wrapped around their little fingers, and that's exactly what Russia did, to the detriment of Ukrainian society and hastening this war.
Yeah. Very well said. Interesting that you mentioned the GOP, the Grand Old Party, the Republican Party in the US. I talked about this on my news video this morning because Trump is being indicted and looks like he could be in quite a lot of trouble. And without going down the whole political, I don't want to politically alienate some of my listeners here or viewers. I'm really interested in actually what's going to happen down the road and American, politically speaking, if you got a change in administration, I'd say, I think like you seem to imply there, that if the Republicans took over, forget all other politics, just thinking about Ukraine, that is more likely that the US would support Ukraine less than if the Democrats continued. And just on that analysis, we're only talking about Ukraine, I think I would favor like the present administration remaining, because I think despite you can argue they didn't get things quick enough or this, I think they have done a remarkable job, really. And it's also not just about the stuff that they give, but unifying other allies, and the amount of pressure they're putting on people like Turkey behind the scenes, pressure on loads of who was it? It was Egypt that was going to make a load of grad rockets for Russia, and then America said, "No, you ain't." It's stuff like that we don't really know is happening, but it has huge impact.
I also have to say, I mean, we're both old enough to remember, I think, what an astonishing change in American politics. If we'd have had this discussion 30, 40 years ago, it would have been the absolute antithesis, the total opposite. It's always been the Republicans that have been very defending other nations, protecting a coalition, and the Democrats who've been a little bit more dove-like. But, from Reagan's days, it's absolutely a complete change, which is why many people still feel that Trump isn't a real Republican, but he says enough to talk about protecting the homeland and America first and all that sort of thing. I don't want to go into all those politics, but it's just an astonishing change between how the Democrats are now protecting the world coalition, the world stable order, and the protecting through strength what we have in our thankfully comfortable lives in the EU, in the UK, in the US, and freedom. And the GOP just seems to be, for some reason, very happy to just give in to Russia time and time again, from what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing, with a few honourable exceptions. Obviously, I think Lindsey Graham's been quite vocal and has been probably put on the sanctions list by Putin now, so well done to him, and a few others. But there's been a wholesale change in Republican attitude. But it comes down to financials, doesn't it? If you can support the war but keep taxes low and still support, then I don't think there'll be much of a problem. But if thankfully for Biden and the current administration, the petrol prices have really come down. The gas prices, as soon as they went really low, then everything was pretty much back okay. Back home, the economy was improving. But if that changes, and if someone starts promising big tax cuts because we can just cut 25 billion from the defense budget here because we're not actually making it for ourselves, we're just giving it away, then that could start to win votes in those crucial states again, as Trump did last time, or the time before rather. So it's a delicate thing to watch for in the fairly near future.
And to answer the question from Eaten by Ghouls, if the counteroffensive fails, do you think it'll have an effect on the West's support for Ukraine negatively or positively? I think it would be a challenge. Like if it failed, you would get a lot more people pressuring to go to the negotiation table. I think that would be the big outcome of that. So there's a lot of pressure on this counteroffensive that it goes well, but there's a lot hanging in the balance, I guess. Thanks so much to Kitty as well. That's really generous. I don't know what MYR stands for, what part of the world that is, but thank you nonetheless. Someone's saying, I read in the news today that Poland might be sending their troops to assist Ukraine. I've not heard anything about that. But what I did hear is that Poland and France and Germany are going to get together and talk about security guarantees for Ukraine. Now, security guarantees, as far as I understand them, are very different from security assurances, which is what the Budapest Memorandum suggested, which is what is going on now, which is we're helping Ukraine without sending our troops there. But security guarantees is like Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which is very different. So do you have anything to say about security guarantees and what that could entail?
I think this is all leading up to the Vilnius NATO summit, which is forthcoming, when Jens Stoltenberg confirmed this morning that agreement had been reached. Now, what exactly that entails, we'll have to wait until it's announced or written down. But yeah, it does involve some sort of guarantee, but I wouldn't want to speculate too much on that. We are highly unlikely to see NATO troops inside Ukraine on the ground. There are so many nations opposed to that. It would never pass the NATO vote. With regard to Polish troops in Ukraine, I don't know whether that's the stories that have been going around for a week or so about a Polish battalion helping the Russian rebels, should we call them, the Defense Corps and the Volunteer Corps and the Legion of Free Russia. But those were pretty strongly and swiftly denied afterwards, saying that they were still only working inside Ukraine. So there are plenty of, probably, I don't know exactly, but I'm pretty sure that the biggest number of foreigners fighting for Ukraine at the moment in a voluntary or even as a freelance capacity would be Polish. So it may come back to that, but I haven't. There won't be official Polish army units being sent to Ukraine for sure. The most they will do is train and be at the border and guard the borders. That's all they will do.
Yeah, and so something else that's been big in the news the last couple of weeks, and I think was a really, I've come to see the value of this. So when Belgorod you had the raids into Belgorod initially at the end of May to Gryveron, and then you had this second incursion towards Shebekino, taking over Novaya Tavozhanka for a little bit. I was thinking, is that wise? Is that going to annoy the Russians? Will the Russian population unite to have a rally around a flag effect? And then, but the more I've thought about it, the more I've thought they're being quite clever in the fact that actually the Russian population really, like, if this hasn't changed their opinion, then nothing will. So it's kind of almost irrelevant now what their reaction would be. But actually, this keeps the Russians on their toes. It fixes Russian forces, and also I hear that there were some very valuable pieces of kit that Ukrainians were wanting, so that it could have been a little bit of a cover for some electronic warfare kit that those groups got hold of as well. And so I've actually swung around to think that was quite clever, especially the amount of time they're in Belgrade and the amount of hassle they caused. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's also a conspiracy theory which amuses me, and so many strange things have happened. You think, well, maybe it is actually possible, and that's that Wagner had pretty much said, you go do it, and might even be helping them in some way, because then it'll make the army look even more stupid. Prigozhin can start to gloat, which he did. Now, this has been said retrospectively, and it's like fitting a narrative with the story that you've got and the results that but it wouldn't surprise me what is happening to Wagner and Prigozhin at the moment, to see a humiliation in a small, fairly insignificant part of Russia on the border. I mean, Shebekina is someplace that none of us, I don't think, had heard of until a couple of months ago. Even looking at the maps, it was almost passed over. You went straight to Belgorod, the regional capital. So it is important, because as long as Ukraine can guarantee, with shall we use quotes there, that no Ukrainian national troops are involved in this and it's a purely Russian partisan movement, then that looks okay. It fulfills the agreements with Western allies, and most importantly, it means some of the equipment and a lot of the troops have got to be stationed there. Not only there, because then they've got to start thinking about incursions into Kursk, another neighboring territory, and as we've said, along the front line, let alone their own borders, Russia, even with its huge army, cannot patrol and defend an entire front line and its own borders. So these incursions that go on just cause yet another headache for the Russian Federation.
Yeah, absolutely. I just think if you keep them guessing as where you're going to attack their own country, then it's the same kind of thing, talking about fixing, sending drones in. So I was originally thinking when they were sending the odd drone here and there into Russia, you're thinking, is it worth like getting a drone and sending it and it gets shot out the sky or falls out the sky? And then I understood that actually, if you start sending drones, Moscow, St. Petersburg, Engels Air Base, all around Russia, which is a huge country, and the idea for me at least is that it doesn't matter if these drones actually do anything. What you're doing is you're making the Russians panic and then fixing air defense systems all around the interior of Russia that they can't send to the front line.
Yeah, they moved a lot of those away, and that's one of the reasons that Ukraine could send in the earlier days very easily to go and hit oil refineries and the like. And I think today's drone attack, for anyone who hasn't seen it, I've got a video on my Twitter feed today in the daily thread of a drone that was flying over Voronezh, a city not particularly close to the border with Ukraine, and it suddenly starts to dive. Now, I'm assuming that it was electronic warfare, so well done to Russia for that, but it dived straight into an apartment block. And so when residents are getting hit, yeah, they can blame Ukraine for sending the drone over, but surely they've got to think, well, A, what is our air defense doing? Why isn't this being cut off at the border? Also, gosh, we really are in a war. And Ukraine says the same thing, when people are killed by falling missiles and debris, it's horrendous. Yeah. And it wouldn't have happened had Russia not fired it. It wouldn't have happened if Russia had not invaded. But it's got to wake up people when drones or anything else is flying into apartment blocks. And that will just, they can say we've shot it down, aren't we really good? But some people have been killed in Russia in a territory that shouldn't be being touched by this war and was never planned. So, everything according to plan for Peskov and for Putin. We love that little
this 3-day war is going just according to plan. It's like, not too sure. Was speaking about Wagner, you mentioned them, you mentioned Prigozhin earlier. I mean, goodness me, what a fascinating relationship, situation with regard to him, the conventional Russian military. And you had this situation the other day in Bakhmut where Wagner captured a Russian 72nd Brigade commander and then roughed him up and got him to admit something. And then he admitted to shelling Wagner and mining Wagner and disarming a unit. And then he was let go. And then he did another video for the Russians saying, no, that was all a lie. My goodness. So what are your thoughts on Wagner and Prigozhin?
Well, Russia's never been particularly good with its PR. They're just used to issuing statements, no one question anything, no one daring to tell Putin the truth or the public reaction. And suddenly everything's changed. And Prigozhin's been a little bit smarter. I mean, I say like him or loathe him. I'm guessing almost all of your viewers hopefully loathe him in some respect. But it's got to be a grudging respect for how he's handling public opinion and how he's undermining some of his rivals, notably Shoigu in the Ministry of Defense, and also, therefore, Kadyrov, whom I mentioned earlier, the de facto warlord leader in Chechnya. So he's done an awful lot of good in getting really huge support among the military, and not just his own Wagner. And a lot of the military almost aspire to be with them. And it was interesting that he was saying, there were adverts within Russia saying to the military, coming towards the end of your 6 months or your year or whatever, that we will pay you a hell of a lot more and you'll be with a better army, you'll be better protected, blah, blah, blah. And a lot of people apparently took the offer of the extra money. The money is used to come from the state, and now it is coming, as we understand it, from raping and pillaging in Africa, diamonds, gold, and whatever else, for providing military services to prop up pretty much dictators in some pretty rich or poor African countries with a lot of mineral resources. So Prigozhin's probably having the best war of anyone in the Russian Federation, I would dare to say at the moment. And I'd said this well over 6 months ago, that he was making a bid to see, just putting his flag up the flagpole and seeing how it flies for a potential leadership role. And I think he is, at the moment, still in a very good position to be the next president of the Russian Federation.
Yeah, and as someone says here, would would Russia be be a better international actor if Prigozhin replaced Putin? Prigozhin, I mean, the problem with him is, on the one hand, he's more of a realist, and he's got his finger on the pulse. So part of the problem with Putin, I've said this before a lot of times, is his access to knowledge, to intelligence, right? So as far as I understand it, Putin is so suspicious of the internet, he doesn't use the internet. He thinks it's a CIA tool, and he doesn't have a smartphone, which means that his entire information space is curated, his entire everything is curated by people giving him information, and he can't verify that without going to other people who will then curate what's being given to him. So he's in this really odd, and that kind of explains how he ended up invading Ukraine. He just didn't have a clue of the situation on the ground, where Prigozhin is actually fairly like, he's a terrible human being, but he's when he would call a spade when stuff is happening that he doesn't agree with. This is what's going on, because he's got his finger on the pulse in a way that Putin doesn't. So if he became leader, yeah, he'll be a bit more realistic in terms of international politics, but he's also a pretty terrible human being as well. So
yeah, he is. The things with the sledgehammers and etc. are just despicable, and I don't think the West could do business with him without fundamental change. But what I would say is that we hear an awful lot of rhetoric, and at the moment, with passions and nationalism so high, no one is going to survive as a political candidate to outright oppose the war, to oppose Putin. Prigozhin's about as near as we get to criticism from within the ranks. So the stuff we're hearing, I mean,
well, you can add, as Aussie Bugger says here, you can add evil Gherkin to that as well, because he's just as evil. But yeah,
absolutely. MH17 convicted terrorist, resulting in the deaths of 300 passengers and crew on that airline, the civilian airline. But take Medvedev as an example, and I do say this to people who say, "Oh, Russians are terrible." Well, no, they're not, for a start. But Medvedev was someone the West could have done business with, and had Putin not been prime minister when he was president to observe the nominal constitution, where Putin couldn't serve a third term, so he stepped down but remained in power. But Medvedev was very much more open, had a lot of good ideas, made relations with the West much better in that very short tenure. And then Putin got a bit scared and started coming on heavy again, and Dima shut up and fell asleep at every meeting again. The stuff he's coming out with now, that is such fascist hatred, it's just not him. And it just shows you that that is the only way that these people can survive at the moment. And once we're in a post-Putin world, then we'll actually see people embracing the realities of the situation and telling the public what the situation is really, how much in debt Russia will be, how their army has been destroyed, how many people have died, because that will be the only way that they can negotiate with the West, which they need to do, and also get the respect of the people, saying that, well, we're not selling out. Putin was doing a good job. Why have you overthrown him? Or blah, blah, blah. They'll just merely say, this is the true number of people that have died, and these are the names. And this is why we're going to erect a memorial in all these cities with the real numbers on. And this is how much it's cost us. And then people all think, oh, Christ, what did Putin do? Why did he do that? Oh, my God, we had no idea. And that will also help the Russian psyche of not knowing what's really going on and turning a blind eye on their day-to-day lives. Their families unaffected. They still have jobs. They're still coming home. The bars, restaurants, theatres still open. Can't go abroad very easily. Not very easy if they do go abroad to afford things, as prices are going up and the ruble's going down. But ostensibly, Russian lives are unchanged for 99% of the population. But when the truth comes out, that's when we will see a softening of the Russian nationalistic front that's been put up. It isn't realistic at the moment. It's just to stay in the game until the new reality dawns.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Lee Bell. Very kind. So we talked about, in the past, we've talked about red lines, about, these red lines that shouldn't be crossed. We can't give tanks. We can't give, originally before that, it's like, we can't give M777 howitzers. Like, well, that they were given. Okay. Nothing happened. We can't give this. Well, they were given. You can't give tanks. Well, they were given. Can't give planes. Well, they were given. So there appear to be no red lines for us to cross. So, like, have we got to a point where we've recognized that we can give anything, and therefore why don't we give anything? Or have we got to a point where the West has worked out that they were empty threats of pressing the red button from Putin, and that was never going to happen. And since that's never going to happen, we're in a position where actually we can do everything. So why aren't we doing absolutely everything?
It's a mystery, and I'm really angry, and I'm angry on behalf of my Ukrainian friends as well, a country that I love and can't work in now, that we haven't supplied as a coalition planes, because I still have fierce arguments with people, even my own followers, some of my own great supporters, who still think it was impossible to enforce a no-fly zone. I don't think it was. Same as the red line that you've talked about. I don't think that Russian air defense would have shot down a NATO jet patrolling over western or central Ukraine, for instance, nowhere near the original line of contact in 2014 to 2022. So I think that we should have volunteered, or Zelensky probably didn't ask, and that's remiss of him because he didn't want to scare the public, but in hindsight probably wishes he had done. It would have just put the push the ball down the road, if you like, the can down the road rather, because it wouldn't have resolved the issue, but it would have meant the Russian troops would have had to retreat, because without air cover they were nothing. The main plan in the north to seize Kiev was to land at Hostomel airport, which they did. They wouldn't have even been able to do that, even when they were defeated afterwards with supply lines cut in the north. Not even that would have happened. And now I just can't believe that we're here this far later, 16 months down the road, and still we haven't got a single useful new fighter jet to Ukraine. I think it's, of all the things that they need, yes, they needed air defense. That's now in a reasonable shape, not great, and they're getting some more from the US in the latest $2 billion handout that's been announced, or is being announced any moment now, I think, actually, Jonathan. We've also covered that in the thread this morning. But planes would have made it far, far easier. It would have advanced the Ukraine. This spring offensive that they talked about, well, it really would have happened in early spring had there been any sort of real backup aerially. The huge problem in conducting a ground force is that a ground offensive rather, is that your force is not protected from the air, protected only from artillery. And Russia still has a very largely intact air force that it can call upon and can send over to Ukraine. And yeah, they'll lose a lot, but they will obliterate a lot of Ukrainian troops as well. That's my real fear. And they need fourth generation fighters. They need F-16s. They need Phantoms, Mirages, whatever we have. They need a decent supply of those.
I mean, it seems the word from, Zelensky seems confident that they're going to get a lot of planes, enough planes, but
so
having
slow.
them in autumn and winter obviously is not ideal. Yeah, this is an interesting comment from Matthew Pocock, who says the remaining red line is allowing our donated kit to be used to target things within Russia. And I find this really odd that the US and even Poland. So you had these attacks into Belgorod that were using Max Pros and equipment, guns from Belgium, kit from different places. So Poland and America and Belgium were like, oh, we're not too sure about this. We need to have an investigation and blah blah blah. And whereas I would have just been, yeah, I know we said don't use them in Russia, but whatever, and just not say anything and just let them get on with it. Because again, like the principle that Russia can attack into Ukraine and Ukraine can defend themselves, but if they do anything that's strategically useful for them that's outside their borders in Russia, that's a no-go. It's like an arbitrary line that I just don't get.
Disgusting. And Matthew's right, and you're right, Jonathan. It's absolutely disgusting. How can Russia launch jets, missiles, bombs, anything it wants from behind Russian lines and know that they are not going to get attacked? Where is the sense in that? That's not a war. That's bullying. That's fighting with both hands and one foot tied behind your back. It's impossible. How can you defend your nation against jets that were over the Caspian Sea again last night, releasing rockets from there, flying back to their Alina air base that's outside of any reach of Ukrainian weapons at the moment? And even inside Russia from Belgorod, they're shelling.
Yeah.
Into Kharkiv and the region almost every night. How can you not be allowed to use Western weapons on military sites? It's just disgusting.
And yet Russia are able to use Belarus as well.
Yeah,
and
absolutely, it's immoral. It is morally bankrupt that we are putting these restrictions. Yes, they should never be used on civilian population. That would be a war crime anyway. Accidents do happen. Yes, missiles are brought down and land, but you have to be able to target. Otherwise, you are saying, oh, carry on then. Yeah. We don't really mind.
Yeah, and as I say, there's no real red lines. anyway left, because I'm pretty sure he ain't going to press the red button. So yeah, we might as well. So as we meandered towards the end, if you got any super chats, get them in. Any questions, please get them in. I'm wondering what you thought about Lukashenko and Belarus and their positioning and his future. There's all this talk about him being ill at the moment. I initially thought there was a high chance it was poisoning, but actually doesn't look like that. It looks like a genuine health issue, but who knows? Any thoughts on any of those subjects?
There are an awful lot of these health scares about Putin and Lukashenko. I've always played them down. They're two old guys. One's a lot older than the other, but Lukashenko isn't in the best of shape physically. We can see that, and he is going to get ill from time to time. I don't buy the conspiracy theories that he's going to die, that he's being poisoned, all that sort of thing. The simple fact is that Belarus is now a de facto part of the Russian Empire, and was ever since Lukashenko stole the election when he clearly lost by all known parameters the last time out, and he needed Russia's troops to be sent in to quell the huge demonstrations, to beat up people, to jail them without trial, and to even hijack jets, as happened with Sofia Sapega and Roman Protasevich. And Russia was behind all that and supporting him. And from that moment onwards, Lukashenko had to do every single thing that Putin said. And Putin's playing the slightly fine line of making sure that the Russian army, the Belarusian army, doesn't get involved, because he knows that that would cause a revolution among normal Belarusian people.
Yeah.
Would be a huge problem for them, because they wouldn't defend themselves against Ukrainian counter-aggression, and they wouldn't be able to defend themselves against the population at the same time if there was mass civil disobedience again.
Michael Weiss for Yahoo News and a co-writer have done really interesting articles where they've got hold of some leaked documents from Russia that have shown their approach to fomenting discord in Moldova, to fomenting discord in the Baltics, and also Belarus as well. And so there's official, like, strategic documents that Russia have produced to get Belarus effectively, a vassal state, which it kind of is, but like it's set out in a document. And there's absolutely no doubt that Russia has those desires and has put things in place for all of those places.
They're so one-dimensional. I mean, we've seen how pathetic and how they've been unable to adapt to modern world, modern techniques of espionage. Bellingcat has exposed just how stupid they are, sequential passport numbers, elementary mistakes, and they still play with exactly the same playbook everywhere they go. They went into the now occupied territories of Georgia, and people didn't speak Georgian there. I think a lot of people spoke Pashto, and some people spoke Russian, but then started handing out Russian passports. We need to protect our people, Russian language, blah, blah, blah. They did the same in Crimea. They did the same in Eastern Ukraine. They've just got one playbook. Just try to divide all the rivals, and for countries near you, just talk about protecting Russian citizens, Russian language, Russian culture, and giving freedom. Well, we all know what Russian freedom looks like, and that's a particular problem for the Baltic states, which do have still a high percentage of ethnic Russians in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania.
Here's a question: why are war crimes charges taking so long? I mean, my answer to that would be, actually, they're not taking long. Normally, what happens is war crimes charges and investigations take place after a war is over. And this is a very rare occasion where they are able to because the war has gone into certain places in Ukraine and then left those places, like Bucha. They're able to do investigations while the war is still going on, and also talk to people on the front lines still. Like, there's a lot of incredible work being done to compile a load of information on war crimes that normally in any other conflict would have waited till afterwards. So it's not a case that it's taking so long. I'd say the opposite. It's actually going quicker than we might normally expect. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think Mr. Khan, who I think is heading the operation, and the ICC have done an absolutely tremendous job, and it's been very brave as well to do what they did as the war is still going on. As the nearest example, we have a couple of examples in Africa, but probably that most of us are aware of is what happened in the former Yugoslavia and Serbia in particular, and the trial, the most high-profile trial of Slobodan Milosevic, and it came years after the end of the conflict.
Yeah, yeah, and there are lots of agencies as well involved. I forget what they're called. They're reporting. Sorry, Ukraine the Latest, which is a Daily Telegraph podcast, had an interview with the two people who are running one of these sort of charity organisations that are training people up to interview people sensitively, but meticulously getting evidence. So they're kind of like doing investigative journalism, if you like, but getting enough really decent evidence to be able to hand it directly to the International Criminal Court. And that's taking place in real time. And it's just incredible. But it's really slow as well, because you have to interview people, multiple people. You have to do it really sensitively and so on and so forth. It's not easy to get those things done quickly, I guess. So for the last sort of little bit, are there any areas of the conflict that you think are worthy of note, that you think are worrying or interesting or bizarre?
I think you mentioned the place earlier that I've for many months said would be crucial, and it's now the de facto occupies capital of Zaporizhia province, and that is Melitopol. I think that's the place to watch. I think the interesting reports this morning that two significant towns to the direct north of Melitopol, leading up to the River Dnipro, there are widespread reports now of Russians fleeing from there, as we saw happened in Kherson region earlier, and it's adjacent to Kherson region. So it's particularly relevant that, you know, banks are closing, a passport office is apparently closed, some shops are closing, and there's a long line of vehicles leaving, thought to be with all the Russian office workers, if you like, the people who keep it ticking over. And shortly after that, it was the military that left, having looted whatever they could thereafter. And I think we might see more of that. And if they can take somewhere like Mikhailivka, which is just over the river Dnipro into Zaporizhia province, then it's a direct line.
Oh, I may have lost Tim there. Not sure if he's going to come back. Tim, where are you? Oh, who knows? That may be the end of Tim. But anyway, thank you very much, everybody, for all of your kind support in this live chat that we've had, this stream. Please pop along to Tim White's Twitter page. Please support him as well. He does a really good job of compiling an awful lot of information on a daily basis. I rely, as you know, in my news video every day on Tim for a lot of great nuggets that get disseminated out to the wider public through my channel. So thank you to him. He's definitely dropped off there by the looks of it. So please, yeah, go and support him. That would be fantastic. There was something I was going to add to what he was saying there. But I guess I can't remember, because that's all thrown me a little bit. But anyway, thank you very much for being part of this live stream. Really appreciate all of your support. You take care of yourselves. Check out my news video that's out, and my frontline video that's just out as well. Lots of content already for you to watch. Tim is back. Here he is. Tim, you're back. Sorry, I was sort of saying my goodbyes there, but you're still there.
Sorry about that.
That's no problem. So
there's a battery
do you want to finish?
And I'm trying to turn it on. Yeah, I've got you now. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. Are you? Is there? Did you want to finish off your thought there at all? Can you hear me? Did you want to finish off your thoughts there at all, or not?
Check see in the sunshine.
Oh, can you? Are you there? Or I don't know that the quality
Hopefully.
of the feed is.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me now.
Oh yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah, fantastic.
Okay. Yeah, so I was just saying it was a direct line south from those towns by the River Dnipro to Melitopol, and if they can get over the river, then that will be a huge problem for Russia and a massive advantage. And Melitopol now has added significance. It's partway down towards cutting off the land border and the land route between real Russia and Crimea. and is the capital of the region, as they've stated, of the occupied region, that is, for the Russians. So if they were to lose Melitopol, it would be massive. And there's a lot of resistance there. We've seen probably the highest proportion of sabotage attacks, improvised explosive devices in that region. So I think it's definitely possible for Ukraine to get that. And talking about what is success and failure, you mentioned it earlier, and building on that, I think we should look towards Melitopol, no matter that at the moment the front line is the place a little bit further along on the Donetsk side of things, bordering Zaporizhia. I would actually look a little bit further west on the map and look at Melitopol and see if Ukraine can get over the river pretty swiftly and then continue the attack on Melitopol full speed.
Yeah, and I did talk about that in an analysis of how the Ukrainians might attack through Zaporizhia a few weeks ago. There's some really interesting threads that I was discussing. I guess one of the last things I'd say then is I originally kind of dismissed the idea that the Russians could capitulate, but actually, when you see what happened in Kharkiv, and now it's a totally different situation now because they've built their defenses and they've done a fairly good job, I would argue, in building defenses, and they are multi-layered. It's not just one. Already today, there was talk about one area was broken through, but they've retreated to the second line of defenses. And, you know, some areas they have 2-3 lines of defenses. So I think it will be harder for the Russians to completely capitulate and rout. But we shouldn't, I don't want to be overly optimistic and like cheerleader for Ukraine here, but we shouldn't dismiss the very real possibility that a bunch of fairly poorly trained, although they're quite well trained in some of these areas of Zaporizhia, but in general, you have poorly trained Russian soldiers who don't really know what they're fighting for. If you start getting a hammering in certain areas, then you can imagine a rout could take place. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's one of the potential outcomes because it has happened twice before. But as you said, without those reinforcements, those defensive lines, and yes, it will be much harder. But we've never seen a Ukraine force this strong enter. Those previous 3 withdrawals, if you include in the North Kiev and the Chernihiv regions, but then Kharkiv and then Kherson, have all been achieved pretty much without an extra bullet being fired. You know, it was a gesture of goodwill, and maybe we'll get another few gestures of goodwill. I think that's a real possibility. I don't think it's a probability, but it is a possibility. It may become a probability in a few weeks. If Ukraine, you know, manages to reach Melitopol within a couple of weeks, then we might really be looking at that, because there will be widespread panic again, the likes of which we haven't seen until since the Kherson withdrawal.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I'd agree. Yes, a very real possibility, but yeah, certainly not a probability. It's all going to be happening. Goodness me, I've been really struggling with both my news videos and my frontline videos because they're bloody attacking everywhere, and I'm sort of like, what's going on with the map? So and with operational security, you know, the Ukraine. So this is interesting. So you get skewed. I don't know if you saw about these 2 columns of Ukrainian vehicles getting hit yesterday, and you're thinking, "God, this is all really this is a real problem." But actually, you've got a situation where only the Russians at the moment in these areas are providing video evidence. So, and they will provide evidence of where they're hitting Ukrainians. There's complete operational security for the Ukrainians. So we're not seeing any of the positive stuff that Ukrainians are doing, and that can give you a skewed representation of what's actually taking place.
Yeah, and that might be good in damping down expectations from the Ukrainians, because they're avidly mopping up everything, including international media. The Ukrainian media are very largely very biased and border on propaganda themselves, although they do have a little bit more shall we say, self-control than the Russian media, which is just state-controlled, almost 100%, of course. So I don't think that's a bad thing. I think people have long been trained that operational security is operational silence, and that when there's something to tell, they will get to know about it, and we will get to know about it first, probably from the Russian Telegram channels again, I would imagine, as we did with Kharkiv and Kherson.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. A lot of the information coming out now are Russian Telegram channels going, "Oh no, oh dear." So and you know, when you hear from the Russians saying things are quite bad, then you can like, well, okay, they're probably a little bit worse than that. And you know, so for example, this morning, one of the Russian Telegram was War Gonzo saying both sides are taking heavy casualties. You're like, well, if a Russian's telling you both sides are taking heavy casualties, that means the Russians are taking really heavy casualties. And it's not to deny that the Ukrainians are taking casualties, of course they are, but if a Russian source is telling you that, then you can imagine the Russians are doing slightly worse.
We do have to bear in mind that all intelligence in war does tell us that the aggressor suffers more casualties. So if there's any sort of discipline among the Russian army, especially with their defensive lines quite well set, there will be really appalling, unacceptable losses for Ukraine. But it is more acceptable than losing an entire country and an entire nation of 40 million plus being subjugated and not free, and totalitarianism, fascism ruling again within Europe. Hopefully those days are gone forever, and this will help extinguish the last manifestations of it that have been appearing in Russia over the past decade or two.
What a brilliant place to end. I mean, what a great way to end that, Tim. Well, look, I've really enjoyed this as ever. I'd love to speak to you again at some point in the future, as we've done in the past, if that's okay with you. Cool beans. Okay, well, look, I've already said goodbyes while you were offline.
Yeah,
so I said my
sorry about the problems.
Yeah, no worries. Well, look, everyone knows to check you out on Twitter. Please do so. Please support him on Ko-fi. Take care, everybody. Really appreciate your time with us, and I really appreciate Tim's time as well. So thank you to Tim, and thank you to all of you. Any last words, Tim?
No, that's just absolutely fabulous to be here. Great chatting with you. Thanks for all the interaction. Thanks for the support. And yeah, let's do it again.
Yeah, brilliant stuff. Okay, thanks, mate.